Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream. We're finally back to normal. We're doing some lectures this time rather than some guests and commentary. But of course, as you can kind of tell by the title and what's been going on in the news, today we'll be taking a look and examining the sort of economic impact of this wartime economy, so to speak, as Radlib had put it. And before we also get started with the lecture, a big thanks to Radlib and Charlemagne. I have their work linked down below in the description. They did make researching and preparing for today's discussion a lot easier. So if you can go ahead, and if you're not following or supporting them already, I highly recommend that you do. So let's tell everybody that we're live, and then we can move to the lecture proper. Okay, so nice to see everyone pouring in. I hope everyone is well. And let's go hide myself. And now we can get started with today's lecture, especially now that we're live and we're ready to go. So let's do it. So an outline for today's discussion is going to cover the impact of the sanctions and the state of not only just the economy here in the United States, but also sort of the global economy writ large. There was a lot of things that were pointed out by Radlib and Charlemagne that I think are going to be very important for us to consider in the future. But give me 1 second. Someone's talking about mic quality, so let me go edit that. Audio. That's why it's the webcam.
How about now, everyone? There we go. We can take care of that. If the for some reason, anytime I have the camera plugged in, it always picks up the camera in before my actual microphone, but hopefully that has now been addressed. So, all right, we can start and get started proper now. So we will have an outline, of course, over the sanctions and the state of the economy. What actually are these sanctions doing, and what that means for not only just the U.S., but some of the other regions of the world that are a little more dependent upon Russian exports and these natural resources. And then two major areas that I also want us to look at, of course, are the impacts on wheat exports and semiconductor production. As we know that wheat prices have been going through the roof as of late, and this isn't just because of the recent military events happening in Ukraine. There was also a steep increase in price beforehand, and this is stuff that you can also take a look at as well in other countries that are dependent upon wheat. So we're going to see a lot of that as well. And then following that, we'll talk about some of the speculative concerns I wanted to talk about with Egypt, considering that they are one of the largest wheat importers of the world, and they're also one of the largest importers of Russian wheat on Earth. And so I had reached out to one of my subscribers who had emailed me in the past about Egypt, and I had a nice conversation back and forth with him. So we'll talk about that. And then second order impacts, as well as some of the socio aspects of sanctions. They're always meant to be coercive, but as we've kind of been able to see in the past, what they normally do is hardening their resolve. And then, of course, we'll talk about diplomatic spillover, because while we think that this is all of our attention is focused on Russia and Ukraine, this does affect virtually every other major diplomatic effort that is going on in the world. So there's a lot there. And then, of course, at the end, all of our wonderful announcements and such. So let's get started. This was the great thing that Charlemagne had discussed on his blog, NeoReactor, on Substack, which you should definitely be following, because Charlemagne finally has paid stuff on there. So by all means, go support him when you can. But he was talking about the Russian economy and what's being targeted and what actual impacts that these sanctions have. And, we talk a lot about sanctioning Russia, sanctioning oligarchs, and banning Russian oil and natural gas from the United States. And we're going to have to, deal with that. So I have this little image up here. This was from the Daily Mail, I believe, earlier today, just talking about that, you're seeing pretty much what we would call the West and sort of westernized countries. So Japan, South Korea, the Anglosphere, a majority of the European Union that are taking actions to freeze dollars and currency. We know that they've been kicked out of the SWIFT system. In fact, even I had received notification from one of my, subscribe to our patrons that things in Russia about donating in dollars is now actually very difficult for him. So that was the message about pausing payments and such. So there are real, we do know that there are real impacts. But as Charlemagne points out, and I think what we'll do is we'll share this tab instead, so we can get to Charlemagne's blog. So share this tab. Here we go. So all of you can now see this. This is what he had put out. And he says, finally, let's have a look at the actual sanctions on Russia so we can all put this together. The most substantial attacks that Charlemagne has seen, and that I've also noticed, has been the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We noticed this earlier when they started putting troops on the Belarusian and Ukrainian border about, having actual cancellation. But this, of course, is an attack on future revenues. This doesn't really affect current money. I don't know if the initial Nord Stream 1 pipeline, to the extent of my knowledge, has not been canceled. Additionally, the EU plans to cut Russian gas imports by 2/3 this year, but at this stage, it's still only a plan. And so that's something to keep in mind. And this image that he has put up here about the United States and the United Kingdom about petroleum, crude, and refined and coal, it isn't particularly much. It's 11 billion in 2019. But the exports of this were 407 billion in 2019. So we're not that much in comparison to their overall crude and refined oil and natural gas exports abroad. The U.S., of course, wants to change its permanent normal trade relations, which means tariffs and other advantages will change. But this won't necessarily play that major role in the economy. I mean, as Charlemagne points out, we're not seeing a lot of impact because the United States and its trade relationship with Russia is not as substantial as what we've seen in other countries. And we'll talk about that later in today's lecture. But some of the best quotes, and this was from CNN, he says, the most commonly discussed sanctions could knock off 1% of Russia's gross domestic product, according to analysts at Capital Economics, but more aggressive measures, such as blocking Russia from SWIFT, could reduce output by 5%. According to Capital Economics, Russia's economy is in a better position to withstand the shock than in 2014, when Western sanctions and plummeting oil prices combined to knock roughly 2.5% off the country's GDP and spark crisis. Russia's balance sheet is stronger, its external debt is lower, and its financial connections with major economies are much smaller. So there's sort of this implication that Russia has, since 2014 and the post-Euromaidan sanctions that came from the annexation of Crimea and the sort of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions now being sort of dealing with Russian separatists, Russia has definitely made its economy more fortified to Western sanctions and its economic imposition that it can put on other countries. So that's something that we can definitely take a look at. And again, Charlemagne's blog link is in the description, and I want to thank him for putting that out. So we do know, of course, that these sanctions will have some impact on the Russian economy, whether it's access to dollars. There was a delightfully humorous video that was going around on Twitter. The son of some Russian artist, this rather obese individual, had chained himself to a McDonald's that had been closed because so many of these companies are closing services allegedly within Russia. And he was protesting the fact that this was the food that he had been eating for 30 years and that these sanctions weren't fair. So there's a little bit of humor, I guess, that we can take out of this. But the one thing that I would observe, right, is that this feels a lot like antibiotic resistance. If you keep using the same amount of drugs or penicillin over and over again, eventually something is going to develop an immune response. And I think that that's what we're seeing here as well. But in addition to this, the oil impact that we're seeing in the United States, and I'm sure those who are living in Europe are seeing it far worse than we are, is that our substantial increase in fuel costs. This has been added on by the sanctions and added on by the invasion. However, this is not a direct cause. This is something that, of course, has been happening in the United States, where prices of fuel had been increasing substantially. They are not anywhere near what they were during the Trump administration. For example, where I live in Texas, gas is around $4.10 a gallon. And I know many in Europe are paying through the nose per gallon, although we have to do some conversion because it's in liters. But again, this does illustrate that the war, at least, has been done through prosecuting the war only economically. And that's something that we're going to see a lot in here. But these economic impacts do play a major role in, the geopolitical sphere of how we conduct relationships with other countries, especially when it comes to OPEC. And we'll definitely be talking about that as well in the future. And Fauzi is actually in the chat. He's our wonderful Egyptian and a channel member. talking about this. He says, news from Egypt and huge increased demand on dollars and gold. So we'll definitely talk about that when we get to Egypt in a little bit. I'm very thankful for him answering my questions and my conversation with him. But we're going to talk about now one of the other things that has been addressed either through the wonderful Cardinals address that Skeptical Waves had narrated, as well as the greater concerns that we've seen in recent tensions, not just in Ukraine, but also in Taiwan. But of course, there are 2 Ukrainian companies that have ceased production since the invasion, Sironin and Ingas. These guys produce roughly 50% of all semiconductor grade neon in the world. So virtually everyone in there is reliant on this, including the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company. And this is just one area in which the price of goods is going to increase. And you're also going to see potentially the securitization crisis happen with these resources. So the invasion is halted due to the invasion. And we're going to see, again, more exacerbation of the supply chain. So domestic goods, of course, are going to get more expensive. You're going to have to wait for goods and services. But on top of this is the fact that the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company gets a significant majority of their neon. I think it's, I believe, about 60 to 70%, last I checked, of their neon from these 2 companies. And the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company put out a statement earlier last week stating they have safety stocks of neon in reserve that they're willing to use, and that they're not anticipating any supply chain issues at the current time. But we do not know how long that will go, and we do not know how long that will last. And this is already in sort of the backdrop of what we're seeing with Taiwan and the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company sort of feeling the pressure about China moving closer and closer towards taking some sort of action on Taiwan, primarily because neon gas is not something that China manufactures a lot of its own, and that the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, is primarily a resource for the West. And they kind of feel this pressure because over the course of the last 8 months, the TSMC has been putting out subsidiaries, and they're trying to move things for manufacturing both into Japan. And I believe they opened up, or they're planning to open up, a manufacturing plant in Phoenix, Arizona. So the chip supply trade has already been under a lot of strain, but now it's in further jeopardy because, the largest producer of half the world's semiconductor grade neon is now at risk. So you will see an increase in car prices. You will see an increase in some elective surgeries. For instance, neon gas that is used for semiconductors is also used for things like laser eye surgery, either to remove cataracts or getting LASIK or anything like that. So you're going to be seeing quite a bit happening there. And I mean, this also had started 2 years ago, more or less, once COVID had started, right? And this is only going to exacerbate those issues. I mentioned in other streams and conversations about how where I live, there are a lot of dealerships are all kind of running the same advertisement saying that the microchips are back, meaning that they can sell more product and more cars, of course, at a higher price. But this is something that we're going to see more of. And the reason why I mentioned the issue of securitization, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, I'm not talking about like trading securities or anything like that. Securitization is talking about, in defense, is the discussion over in international relations and international politics. It's the process of nation states or state actors making certain subjects, usually that are regular political issues, and now they're transformed into matters of security. So while we're talking about domestic goods, you also should probably consider the need to have semiconductors to run your missiles, to run your advanced 5th generation jet aircraft, all the things that you would need for a military or at least a modern military to function. So the securitization of these kind of resources will be a matter of national security, not just for the United States, but also for the Chinese, who have been amping up their own military production, particularly within their naval capacity. And as the concern over the phrase breakaway republic has been used by the Chinese as of late, they say in quotation marks, as to ensure that we're not applying the same logic of breakaway republic in Donetsk or Luhansk to Taiwan. So we will see, I think, in the future, the issue of semiconductor production be a security issue, primarily, first and foremost, between the United States and China, making the already high tensions between, the the high tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan already even higher. So what we will most likely see is probably some strategic reserves of neon gas being used and in the United States. And then secondly, we will probably see both executive decisions from the Chinese and American governments about trying to expand domestic production, although this will not ignore or delay any conversation we're currently seeing over that of Taiwan. So there are already substantial risks and there will be spillover effects as discussed. Additionally, the other item that I wanted to talk about, of course, is the wheat fertilizer and the exacerbation of both of these issues. So while the United States, and this is something that was pointed out about Russian imports in Charlemagne's blog, the United States doesn't import that much of Russian wheat. And in fact, Russia is not one of the global largest exporters of wheat. That's usually China, India, and the United States. But sanctions and speculation have sent wheat futures skyrocketing, and in turn, the price of wheat, as I have this image here from the Spectator Index, this was tweeted out yesterday. The wheat price 2 years ago was about $506, I believe, per ton or per pound, one of the two. And 1 year ago, it was $638. Now it's almost doubled at $1,100. So we're already going to be seeing this impact globally. Not only will this exacerbate supply chain issues with wheat, but also you're going to see nations that are heavily dependent upon wheat imports look for alternatives and try their best to get around sanctions and work with other countries. However, it is important to note that certain countries that are dependent on Russian wheat and exports are not necessarily going to be on that hostile nations list that the Russian government had put out through its foreign ministry. Notable countries, a lot of African countries were ignored. Egypt is one of them, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But this will have second order impacts on other countries, such as Iran and Egypt. Iran, especially when it comes to the issue of the trying to resume talks of the Iran nuclear deal, which has been one of the biggest foreign policy initiatives of the United States since Biden's administration began to, run the government. But this isn't just the only area to be concerned about. So things that are necessary that we've seen from American and Western-led sanctions. This includes Russian natural gas. So, for instance, Russian natural gas is one of the main items that is imported by Brazil. And you'll notice that Brazil had voted to abstain when it came to the UN condemnation of Russia to maintain their relationships. Bolsonaro has recently met with Putin to discuss their ties between their two countries. And when that all takes place, it's because natural gas is necessary for the nitrogenation of fertilizer in Brazil for its agricultural sector. So Russian natural gas keeps it afloat. And the issue of sanctions, of course, is something that we're seeing not in the world as well. And I think as someone had pointed out in the chat, and I'm going to have to confirm this, but I bet this is probably true. Ukraine is the #1 supplier to the United Nations for their global food program. And so we're going to look that up. Global food program, US or UN. And let's see here, Ukraine. Yeah, look at that. They are one of the largest there for the World Food Program for Ukraine. Wow. So that's another thing to consider, that this will affect foreign aid when it comes to wheat. So another serious area to consider is the fact that international charities and international food programs may also see second order impacts on this as well. If Ukraine's agricultural sectors, which vary throughout both Western and Eastern Ukraine, you will see a lot of problems there as well. And Skeptical Waves is also linked in the chat what that will have global impacts as well. But there are going to be a ton of these second order impacts here that are going to affect relationships between the United States, Russia, and some of the allies in which Russia has tried, or the United States has tried to have a closer relationship to. The United States, both during the Trump administration as well as this one, has been trying to renew its engagement with South America. And we've seen that not work to a significant degree of success. We mainly have seen this because Biden is very adamant to not have a strong relationship with Bolsonaro, mainly over political concerns, mainly over human rights, democratic institutions, and norms. And at the same time, the relationship with, say, Mexico and other South American nations and Central American nations has also been drifting away from the United States. As we talked about this a few months back about Chinese investment in South America, we do know that the Obrador administration in Mexico has been leading the charge to drift away from the Organization of American States, which of course is the 1945 organization for sort of North America to have a greater relationship with, its southern counterparts. But to avoid sort of the American and Anglospheric influence, they've been trying to push towards CELAC, SCELAC, which is about Central and Caribbean and Latin American states. This is primarily more left-leaning in nature. And this is primarily more about, drifting away from sort of the West, and by that, the United States and its influence, of course, over the last 125 years. There have been numerous, interventions from the U.S., of course. This is where you hear the phrase Yankee imperialism from everyone from like Nicolas Maduro back to when Fidel Castro was alive. And they've been moving towards a stronger relationship with both Russia and China primarily. And not to mention that Mercosur enjoys a very healthy relationship with the Russian Federation. So all of this is going to see the second order impact about the global economy. And I also want to go back real quick to the image that we have about sanctions that are being in place. Notice that India, China, and the most populous parts of the world have not joined in on the sanctions campaign. So when we talk about the international community, typically what we're meaning by that is usually the U.S.-led post-war order, which of course always has an impact on how that affects other countries and their relationship with the West. So this is something to keep in mind as well. Not to mention that when it comes to like Russia, vaccine diplomacy has played a significant role both with China and Russia and South America. Brazil has enjoyed a relationship with the Chinese and Russia for their vaccines rather than the United States and its COVAX initiative. So we're definitely seeing a lot of these relationships sour that had been trying to see American rapprochement under the last administration. But it's also important to keep in mind with this map, right? The Western world is not the world. It is merely the West. So you're seeing abstentions, right, from, of course, India, China, all of South America and Africa, most of the world's population. So for once, I'm going to be using the argument that, it's not the people matter in this instance. But again, there will be second order impacts here. So urea, nitrogen, potash, all of these futures have skyrocketed, and their impact that we're going to see on fertilizer prices. Farmers are already paying through the roof for fertilizer. And most recently, as Man Integrated on Twitter pointed out, he's a fantastic person to follow on Twitter if you are wanting to know how logistics works. Due to COVID restrictions in the Shenzhen area, which I believe in China, if I'm remembering my geography correctly, is a major port and for exporting. So we're already going to see Chinese exports close down even faster. So that's also going to have an impact because China has also been restricting its urea and ammonia exports to the West as sort of a pressure in the ongoing trade conflict between the U.S. and the Chinese government. So again, fertilizer is only going to go up, which means the prices of other foodstuffs like wheat is going to go up, and their second order impacts not just on the West, but on other areas that do not enjoy major agricultural sectors or their or their lifeline are on these countries like China and Russia. They may significantly exacerbate. We'll be talking about that as well. And this also, when we're going back to that map, India, of course, has been threatened by the Biden administration for sanctions, despite the fact that we've been trying rapprochement with India for years with the Quad and security arrangements against the Chinese. But keep in mind that India, for example, is a significant importer of Russian arms. And they are already probably very concerned that the United States as an international actor can't be trusted on these security issues, especially after 3 administrations trying to increase their relationship and rapprochement with India. So we will definitely see a lot of changes in the future when it comes to this. But so this was where we're talking about wheat. I wanted to talk more about Egypt in particular because I had done a brief thread on Twitter about this, and I wanted to ask more questions. So Fowd Fauzi, who's in the chat, was very kind to let me email him and just ask him a few questions about how things are on the ground or doing. So I'm gonna go. I know you can see it on screen, but I'm going to sort of outline what I thought was a speculative concern that I had in regards to wheat and some of the research I've done when we've talked about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in the past two streams over the course of last year. But this was my concern. So wheat prices have skyrocketed, and it is Egypt is the largest importer of wheat globally, which is kind of depressing when you consider that Egypt was once the breadbasket of the Roman Empire in terms of wheat production. But they are one of the largest importers of Russian wheat as well, and those prices have seen substantial increase. And this is already dealing with the fact that, if I recall correctly, Egypt has been dealing with double-digit inflation for quite some time. If I let me see if I can get the rate out. Actually, no, it's been down actually right now. According to inflation characteristic, it's only 6.5%. But in 2018, it was significantly worse. So things have gone down, which is good news to know. But between inflation, unemployment, and the fact that there is some substantial foreign debt as well, I think that would be rising concerns for these costs. I know that they're already dealing with embankment issues that the Al-Sisi government is trying to regulate. And at the same time, it's very cheaper for farmers to grow things like cotton and instead of foodstuffs. So I think that will definitely add on to other issues that the president has been dealing with, primarily that of rising salinization levels inside the Nile River Delta. So, again, most of its population lives along the Nile River Delta, especially being vital to Egypt's economy and its lifeblood. It's the carotid artery, essentially, of the country. And so this is all happening with rising wheat prices. Its relationship with the United States is probably getting a little more tense. We do give them a lot of foreign aid. And now the prices have increased, both from Ukraine and Russia. This is already in the backdrop of the fact that the Ethiopians have begun their third filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and they're not holding trilateral talks between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. They're hosting bilateral talks. So you can't get one to talk to the other. It's that, Ethiopia and Egypt are going to have talks. And by the way, the Sudanese and the Ethiopians are going to have talks. There hasn't been a lot of trilateral negotiation and discussion. Add on top of the fact that the Ethiopians are still fighting a civil war when it comes to the Tigray and the OLA, and they're trying to make sure that they don't get closer to Addis Ababa, the capital. I just potentially see that this being an area where this could escalate to a real crisis. And so, thankfully, I asked Fauzi some questions on this issue when it came to wheat, and he was very thankful to answer my email. And this is why I'm incredibly thankful for the international subscribers and followers and supporters, because you guys really help keep me informed with this man-on-the-ground sort of answer. So he told me that Egypt right now has about 8 months in reserves for wheat. He does say that prices will go up, and of course, Egypt isn't on the non-hostile countries list, so they can probably engage in trade with Russia to some degree. However, of course, the issue with the dam still remains. Like I had mentioned, there's not a lot of strong negotiations between the three countries. There hasn't been a lot of trilateral talks. The 2015 agreement that was set between the three countries has been basically thrown out the window because the Ethiopians have been acting more or less unilaterally. And they said that they're in the middle of a bidding process. They tried to bid for other countries, but they only got one nation to submit a bid. So I imagine that the government will continue this. And those were some of the answers that he gave to me. And I thought that those were incredibly helpful to sort of base my understanding of what's happening there. Primarily because these sanctions, of course, will continue to send the prices skyrocketing. They're far different than what they were, as we saw from the Spectator Index report. And then secondly, with the fertilizer issue, and the growing salinization and embankment problems of management of irrigation and the river itself, I do worry that, in 6 months' time, when you're going to need to start planting and things like that, all of that will definitely be a major impact, and I think will be exacerbated by the dam issue because they are filling, they're beginning to generate electricity. And of course, one of the biggest issues here, right, when it comes to that dam, was what was the biggest problem about it? That it could potentially alter the flow of the Nile or how much water flows into the Nile upwards to 25%. Like, this is no chump change, it's no small number, which again, I think is one of the biggest hotspots that we should be paying attention to over the course of the next 5 years. I just think that this is an area that might exacerbate the situation on the ground. So, again, thank you, Fauzi, for answering my questions and emails. I'm very thankful for it. But those are just some of my thoughts and speculation in the wake of the war in Ethiopia, the Sudanese government getting back on its feet from, I think, last November, having its government or its military, kick out some leadership and then reassert civilian control. So this is an area that we should be paying attention to, and this was something that I put in the New Year's forecast streams for us to pay attention to. So do pay close attention, everybody. But again, there's also diplomatic spillover, primarily with Iran and OPEC. We know that fuel prices have skyrocketed. The administration has, in the United States at the very least, has not been having the world's best time in trying to negotiate with, say, Saudi Arabia and others there, which, of course, has illustrated how strong our relationship with OPEC has been since the Biden administration has taken over. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the JCPOA, which of course is I believe the Joint Commission Plan of Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, which originally came out of that P5+1 agreement, has also been thrown into disarray. So last Friday, for those listening, this was March 11th, 2022, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, had said that we will not engage in any further talks with the Iran nuclear agreement unless we can get guarantees that any sanctions put on the United States or by any other EU or Western-led countries has any impact on the Russian-Iranian trade relationship. And as of today, I checked the Wall Street Journal this morning. The Americans pretty much balked and said, no, we can have no guarantees of this. So this is already on top of the fact that, as we saw just earlier this weekend, there was a missile strike in Erbil, Iraq, that the Iranians are taking responsibility for. It was not too far from I believe the American embassy or some American State Department facility, and there were video footage of this missile strike. So that, of course, makes it even more complicated. There's been arguments and allegations that this wasn't going after the Americans, but rather the Israelis. But it has thrown things into disarray because the administration here in the United States, trying to get Iranian oil and I believe Venezuelan oil, has not been going too well. So not to mention that, negotiations has not been working as well as we'd like, because, discussions of a renewed nuclear deal would also see a surge of Russia, of that kind of oil also coming into American markets in exchange for sanctions relief about this sort of nuclear deal happening to not have a bomb produced. The Washington Post last month was talking about this, stating explicitly that any sort of agreement between Russia or between the major parties involved with Iran and its nuclear program means that the United States could start importing Iranian oil. As we do know, over the course of the last 25, 30, 40, I mean, there's been sanctions on Iran for decades, but it has increased substantially since the 2000s. And there are plenty of arguments that have been made that it hasn't worked. Specifically that, the Americans seizing oil tankers from Iran in international waters has not worked. And that was something that the Biden administration was considering to stop doing, as it considers easing sanctions to get Iranian oil to the United States. Also, in the backdrop of this was that, in order to have a conversation with, I believe, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and I believe the UAE. Let me make sure I'm being correct there. Yeah, the United Arab Emirates. Biden tried to get a phone call with both of them, and he was promptly ignored. And when that took place, both of those countries, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, had a conversation with President Vladimir Putin instead. So this is why when I mentioned OPEC, there's that little plus sign next to it, because OPEC plus does include Russia, So the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, plus Russia. And of the two largest producers, of course, are Saudi Arabia and Russia. And there are plenty of countries, as Charlemagne had pointed out in 2019 exports, that Russia's economy is greatly beneficial of. Their largest exports, of course, are crude and refined petroleum, and then petroleum gas and coal briquettes. Crude petroleum alone makes, I believe, 30% of Russia's economy in terms of exports as of 2019. So again, you could see why Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are probably trying to maintain a very close relationship, right? Because this is basically a cartel, and this does allow them to have the advantage and leverage over the United States, because the U.S., of course, stopped the Keystone XL pipeline. We've found that our infrastructure during this administration is particularly vulnerable. There was a ransomware attack on this issue. So, the adults are back in the room, everyone. The adults are in charge. But these pressures to increase production in the wake of Russian sanctions had led to pretty much Biden being ignored flat out. So, in previous attempts to have Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries increase production in the wake of Russian sanctions, I believe it was Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia that had said very explicitly that we cannot replace Russia with increased oil production. So, things to keep in mind. And thank you for the clarification. Khalifa K says Mohammed bin Salman, or Mohammed bin Khalifa, is the Prince of Abu Dhabi, and the de facto ruler of the UAE. So there you go. Those were the two people that had ignored the phone call: bin Khalifa and bin Salman of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So things to all, of course, keep in mind when we're talking about this. The sanctions placed upon the United States has not led to any significant increase in oil production, which has led to the United States looking towards Iran and these negotiations, but also Venezuela, of all people. Venezuela has been an area of the United States to sort of negotiate potential to ease on sanctions about there. So one of the things that had been talked about, while it's gotten blowback from the American Congress, one of the things that was discussed that Reuters reported, I believe on Thursday, actually no, Friday, on Friday the 11th, Venezuela could of course add over 400,000 barrels per day to oil output if the United States were to approve the license. And as we know, they've been trying their best to ease sanctions. There's probably something that has happened, or that there is a deal in the works, mainly because there was American prisoners that were released from the Venezuelans just earlier this last week. So I do think that in the future, we will potentially see the diplomatic spillover affect U.S.-Venezuelan relations. Keep in mind that during the Trump administration, there was a big push for regime change to get Maduro out of office. The Venezuelan economy is not doing well. We can take a look at almost any article about the Venezuelan economy to kind of see that, both just from American sources, but also just, international news as well. They've been dealing with, double-digit growth in the negatives. I believe their 5-year compound annual growth has been somewhere around negative 22%, or somewhere in the 20s, the last I checked it. And for a population of 30 million people, things are not doing well, as it tries its best to return to growth in 2022, as the oil prices continue to increase. I know that Nicolas Maduro has said that 2022, the Venezuelan economy is beginning to grow, or at least within the last fiscal year, it's seen growth. But again, sanctions and negotiations are going to continue. So if Maduro is still in charge, and he seems to be the case that he is, this basket case could very well potentially have their saving grace because the Americans won't be producing oil on their own. But those are just a brief overview. This is going to be a briefer lecture today, and I know that a lot of people had questions, so we can kind of go over them. But as again, this is an ongoing situation when it comes to the sanctions. This is going to have a lot of impact, of course, on diplomacy elsewhere. And we're going to see a lot of first and second order impacts all over the United States, globally, especially as major powers try to maintain their relationships with other countries, as the line in the sand has been drawn mainly by Western American led powers, the Anglosphere, and westernized the Asian countries versus the rest of the world. We'll probably continue this conversation next Sunday about the second order effects and the spillover. I think that it's important that we start taking an increased focus on Saudi Arabia as well as India and American relationships and foreign policy, because we're already beginning to see the fault lines emerge from these sanctions. All of those countries that have abstained from the United Nations resolution condemning Russia are some of the growing powers. I think that it was an observation that there was going to be that it was the BRIC countries, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the S at the end, the BRICS. So the fact that India hasn't joined on, South Africa hasn't, and Brazil especially is definitely there to keep in mind. But on top of that, we'll continue next week to see the second order effects spill over there, because the diplomatic relationships, I think, are irreparably changed because of this sanctions campaign. Relations between Iran will continue to be tense, whether it's the nuclear agreement talks, the recent missile strike, as we mentioned earlier, and of course, oil. On top of this, of course, for domestic goods and people like you and I, we're regular working people, the price of gas, cars, computers, phones, they're all going to continue to rise. And then, of course, the impacts in the Middle East and Africa should also be paid with close attention, because there's been an increase of rioting inside of Iran, and the state media is getting increasingly worried about this and calling out to those that are in charge rather than calling out to the people. This came from some African outlets that I was reading today. So there's a lot there to also keep in mind, especially when it comes to food crises, because both Egypt and Iran do have history of major rioting, major rioting when it comes to food prices. So those are my final thoughts for today's lecture, but don't leave just yet, because if you are new to the channel or you're new to sort of what the Sunday stream is, we'll have some announcements. And then, of course, no matter how dour the world situation is, we always end with something a little cozy and a little uplifting. So as for some channel announcements, now that the event is over, now that I'm kind of getting back into a regular schedule, we're going to get back to more scripted videos. I've noticed that it's been a lot of streams and a lot of fishing, unscripted talk. So we're going to get focused back to some scripted content. One of them will be a response piece, and then the other one, of course, will be an Odyssey exclusive. That is the issue of transplant patients and being denied organs because they're unvaccinated. So on top of that, patrons are going to get access to a video that is exclusive for them, because I want their feedback. It's going to be a reading series and sort of like a book club. And if you are a patron and you're listening, then you'll know in April we'll be starting our own book club about After Liberalism by Paul Gottfried. And then after that, I'm going to be just spending the rest of today doing channel upkeep and waiting until the evening when I can eat. I've been a bit, you get used to the cantankerousness, and I think I'm finally adjusted to the one meal a day thing with Lent. And so we'll be fixing merch. We'll be updating the merch store. We'll be updating our playlists and things like that. And then one of the scripted film reviews that my patrons have been joining me on with movie nights and such will be Sergeant York, which came out in 1941. And I'll just be talking about that, sort of the narrative that gets spun. It was sort of used as a propaganda film to get people interested in the war after Pearl Harbor. So a lot there that kind of tells the liberal story of the American idea abroad. But those are all the announcements that I have. And GC Mitt, it is going to be After Liberalism by Paul Gottfried. So I will send you guys, if you're channel members, I'll make a community post for you guys explicitly so you know when to do it, when we're having it, and that's what's going to happen. And that'll definitely be the case. But for everyone who's still on board and listening, where it's time for everyone's favorite part, which is the frog of the week. And if you're unfamiliar with this, we always end with one. It's a different frog species every time with a little bit of fun facts. So here you go. Oh, see if I get the music playing. That would be nice, wouldn't it? And as always, thank you to Cyberpunk Internal Affairs for the theme there. He's actually done up an intro theme for future streams. So we'll have a stream intro like that of Semiagog and Apostolic Majesty, who he's also done great work for. You can find him on Twitter at CyberpunkIA. So he's a great guy to follow for music. Anyways, this week's frog of the week is the marsh frog. Everyone has got a lovely little frog for us all today. Their habitat ranges throughout Western, Eastern Europe, parts to Russia, all the way up to the near edges of Siberia, and all the way down to some parts of Saudi Arabia. So they are quite the survivable little bugger when it comes to living all over the world in these kind of environments. They have quite a bit of coloration variety, but during the springtime, they always get very, very, very dark green on their backs because, of course, being cold-blooded animals, you kind of want to absorb as much heat as you can to keep you warm. And the males and females usually grow almost equal in length. The females, of course, they're a sexually dimorphic animal, that of frogs. They're always going to be a little bit bigger, but the male grows to about 4 inches in length on average. And when it comes to be springtime, when they wake up from hibernation, they've got a magnetic sense of direction. So they'll be able to tell from, the electromagnetic field that surrounds the Earth to guide them towards ponds that they need to breed. So that's where they go. So it's quite a unique sense of direction that they've got. On top of that, they hibernate in the winter, and as you can kind of tell from the picture that I have on screen, they'll like to burrow themselves either into the mud and dirt, or they'll just typically go to the bottom of a pond underwater. And in places like Egypt and parts of Turkey, they may have a mutual relationship with water buffalo. So you can actually see them on top of the backs of water buffalo, eating insects and flies and keeping them away, potentially reducing the disease likelihood that a water buffalo could get. So a lot of herpetologists are studying this relationship to think of it as some kind of symbiotic or mutualistic relationship. It's definitely something that we're seeing here. So this is, of course, the marsh frog. We end every show like this for you guys from your enjoyment. And now we're going to just catch up with some super chats and hang out with you guys to answer any questions. And thank you all, of course, to the top tier patrons on my Subscribe Star link is down below. You guys pay for my anti-rejection medication for my transplant stuff, which I'm very thankful for. You make it a lot cheaper. And you guys take care of the StreamYard stuff and the audio editing equipment that I use. So the gentlemen on screen donate $20 a month or more on Subscribestar. Yeah, your support goes a very long, long way. And all the other links, courtesy of Charlemagne, are on findmyfriends.net/the Prudentialist. You can find my Substack, the merch, Odyssey, Telegram, Gab, everything that you want to engage with. If you don't like mainstream tech platforms, I'm everywhere else, so don't you worry. And let me go open up Studio now so I can check on a couple of super chats that got sent in earlier today. And now that we're at the end of the lecture, here's what I am going to do. I will, let's see here, change the layout. And here we go. Oh, there we go. All right, cool. So we'll go check on monetization and go to super chats real quick. And then we'll just take questions from everybody else. I try to be as inclusive as I can with the audience here. So, first question that got asked was from Monothalmos. He says, with their love of sanctions, libs prove once again that they are that they absolutely do believe and Retributive justice, if it targets the right people. Well, I mean, again, the politics of the friend enemy distinction is very, very real. So I'm not surprised in the slightest when it comes to that issue at all. And then let's see here. Hunger, the dye merchant, who's also a great supporter of the channel, got to meet him at the US event. Fantastic dude. He says, what are your thoughts about Biden getting ghosted by MBS and the Prince of Abu Dhabi? There was a report that they've been busy that they have bought Russian arms months ago. I'm not too familiar if they've been buying Russian armaments, but that wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. At least Saudi Arabia has been heavily using American arms, so I don't know if that's changed or if they're sort of sensing a change in the wind. I think the Saudis did buy the S-400 missile series, so that's something to keep in mind in there as well. So yeah, no, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest, but those are the super chats. So if you guys send any more in, I'll be sure to respond to those. But someone is asking for Cyberpunk Internal Affairs channel, so I will link that in the chat here real quick for all of you guys. But until then, I'm more than happy to hang out with you guys for a little bit, answer any more questions and things like that. And let's see here. Cyberpunk Internal Affairs, there's his channel. So the gentleman who's done all the wonderful music, here you go. Fantastic. So that and is linked in the chat, everybody. All right, so let's see here. Go through questions. Someone's asking if the pond is natural or if it is man-made. So no, it's a very natural pond. It did get it larger, so technically there's two ponds. There's a small little bridge in between them if you've noticed the fishing videos. But the original one where I do most of the fishing videos, that's natural, as small as it is. But it did get an expansion not too long ago when we were clearing out some space. No one asks, why has the United States not made Mexico comply with sanctions? Asks Minoan. I would imagine because the United States doesn't want to piss off one of its closest trading partners to the South. Strategically as well as economically, that probably wouldn't be the wisest decision, considering that, we still have a bilateral trade relationship with them, not to mention the new USMCA trade agreement between the US and Canada and Mexico. But I mean, consider right across the border, right? There's a lot of manufacturing. You have the maquiladoras. This has been sort of the status quo since NAFTA about American manufacturing and production. So I wouldn't imagine that they would want to try and anger one of their closer economic trading partners. So that's something to definitely keep in mind on that issue. Let's see, what other questions are there has there been other than that one? Theodore Ganymede asked, did you hear anything about 16,000 Middle Eastern volunteers for Russia? I did hear that there have been volunteers flown in from the Middle East into that area, which I don't know if it was that number, 16,000. It seems rather large. I think that we would know more about it, but I'll have to double check and confirm. I have seen reports that there are Middle Eastern forces that have been flown in there, or at least volunteers, right, or terror groups, which kind of confirms one of the things that I was really worried about when we talked about the New Year predictions, was that if this thing does escalate into an actual conflict, it'll be very much like Syria with various Islamic militias and terror groups being flown in to keep it contained inside a country, similar to that of what's happened in Syria. So that's something that I'm a little worried about. I'll have to follow through with that. American Populist asked, how much will Europe suffer from higher food prices and gas prices as well? Well, as I've talked with some Europeans, again, from people who live either in Hungary or other parts of Europe, whether it's Germany or Russia, they've mentioned the gas prices are through the roof. And again, they pay per liter. So you have to do the math. I think somewhere was paying like $12.70 a gallon. But I mean, also keep in mind, right, that they're not nearly as car dependent as we are in the United States. So their infrastructure may potentially alleviate some of it, but it's not to say that farmers are going to be suffering the same way that many farmers and rural people are going to suffer here in the US. So it's something to consider there. And I mean, food is going to get more expensive. The shelves are going to see a lot more empty places. I kind of would recommend to a lot of people just find those old World War II Victory Garden, instructions and manuals and just try to grow what you can from there. So things to definitely keep in mind. I mean, they'll suffer, and I mean, we'll suffer. It's not like that we're going to benefit anything out of it, as we kind of know from decades of sanctions, right? That it's not just beneficial, it doesn't just hurt the civilians in the country that you're targeting. It also hurts the civilians inside the people who are actually doing it. So yeah, but of course, this is a good point from Melphis. Finland suffers extra hard due to our insane taxes. Our infrastructure is kind of like America due to it being so sparsely populated and forested. So definitely something to consider here. And now that the Europeans are in the chat, they can give me some more perspective. Mark Doppelganger, who's also on Twitter and one of the people that helped me get started when I was doing Twitter and YouTube and all that stuff. You should go follow him. He does very good threads. He says, European observations, the gas prices here are painful at the moment. The food prices are up, and it's been compounded by the instability of it. I heard that there are some gasoline shortages near Ukraine. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. But I do really hope that all is well over there. But let's see here. Walrus had pointed out. Walrus also covers a lot of stuff in Scandinavia. He does a great channel talking about these things. By all means, subscribe to him as well. He says gas prices are insane at the moment, and transport and farming potentially severely impacted in years to come. Yeah, they will be feeling the impact of this for decades. I do not think that this is going to be anything that's short term. I do think that the global economy has definitely has changed. A gentleman whose name I'm not going to even try and pronounce because I don't read anything Cyrillic. Is there any chance that Russia will start its own domestic semiconductor industry? I would imagine, like I said, with like securitization, that you'll probably see a push for Russia, China, even the United States to pursue domestic semiconductor production. The question becomes like, how much neon do you have? Do you have the capacity to, create it? I'm not familiar with how neon gas is made or produced or where you can extract it from. But I would imagine that these nations would try their best to do so, especially because you would need to maintain a modern military that way. And you also have to maintain your own research and keep up with the security dilemma that happens across the world with global power. So I wouldn't be surprised. Richard Crook says the Russians have Frog, a free rocket over ground artillery weapon systems. I don't know how true that is. I'm going to have to go look that up now. But let's see. Any other questions or comments? Let's see. Polish ambassador says that I duly report that alcohol prices have not risen. I'll keep a vigorous check on the matter near the future. Don't you worry. Well, by all means, Polish ambassador, I haven't really worried about alcohol since I can't drink anymore, but I'll keep that in mind. There's a great video by Asianometry about the Russian semiconductor industry. Well, I'm going to have to go look that up and maybe find more information about it. So, wonderful. That's good to know. Let's see. Is the neon gas anywhere near areas of Russian occupation? So, as I had mentioned, one of them is near Odessa, which, if I recall correctly, it's been an area of intense fighting. I don't know how much of that territory the Russians have captured. I have to check the latest maps. But one of those companies is based in Odessa, and both companies have ceased all production. So they're not making anymore, right? So they're concerned about the fighting, and if one of them is near where actual, kinetic shooting is happening, then yeah, I'd imagine that this is near areas of occupation. So things to consider there as well. Melphis continues saying Finland also had fun news where it's Russia's fault our food prices are going up while we are on our own gut about Russian corporate cooperation for good boy points from the EU. Well, again, it's sort of that sanctions regime that we're kind of seeing out of here. It's definitely going to have a lot to put in place. Brandon William asks, just hopped on, so sorry if you've already answered this, but how screwed are the Europeans if Russia cuts all energy exports? Well, at the moment, a lot of the sanctions that have been put in by the EU and other NATO countries, right, has been talking about still allowing oil and natural gas exports to come in. I don't think Germany has said anything about their sanctions that they're going to do that. I mean, if all things were going to be cut off, if they decided to, it would be just as suicidal for Russia to stop all energy exports to Europe. Because one, that's their significant political leverage. Two, because they need it. So things to keep in mind in that instance and regard. But they would definitely be hurting a lot. But Russia would be just the same. So And as Raging Mandrill points out, the Institute for the Study of War, while it's a neoconservative think tank, they've been pretty accurate compared to other maps. So I follow them, the Institute for the Study of War. They provide pretty regular and consistent updates if you want a map to see how well or how far advanced the Russian forces have. And then Matsuka had said, do you think that the U.S. has moved now towards forever war towards Ukraine? Well, I think that's probably the case. Keep in mind that NATO and the U.S. have said that American troops are not going to fight there. NATO is not going to implement a no-fly zone. So hopefully that's not hopefully that if anything of this situation, that's probably what they're moving to, because I don't think anyone wants a state-on-state conflict map between two nuclear powers. And he says, in that Western sanctions map, notice with those red countries, you'll see that Norway is in the white. Yeah, I did notice that. I don't imagine that Norway wants to make their relationship very, any more tense with Russia than it already is. Has Russia accomplished all of its objectives in Ukraine now? I'd probably imagine not. Again, this is pacification and denazification, what are the official reasons given. But I mean, Zelensky is still in power. They want sort of a neutral territory that's in there. I would imagine that really the objectives would be something along the lines of making whatever's left of Western Ukraine some kind of territory that's neutral, pacified, not a part of NATO, maybe part of the EU. Zelensky gone, with a different sort of regime in place, preferably something like Belarus with a friendly party like Lukashenko, and that their access to the Black Sea is cut off entirely. I would imagine that would be a strategic objective, because if you can have a land bridge that connects Crimea, Sevastopol, all the way to like Transnistria, where you're taking Ukraine out of the equation from the Black Sea, then I think that gives you a relationship there. So I don't think that will be the case. But there was a 10 euro super chat in. We'll answer this. David White says, the UK Minister for Agriculture tells farmers to go organic. Farmers Union tell her that she is in a fairy tale. Farmers state crops will be down 60% if no fertilizer is used. So yeah, like I had mentioned earlier in the stream, ladies and gents, and again, David, thank you so much for the £10. All of this money doesn't go to a bank account or anything. It goes to paying for pills or maintaining the channel. But that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, fertilizer prices are through the roof, and a lot of fertilizer exports for things like ammonia and nitrogenation are not coming from countries that are particularly friendly to the West, or at least the Anglosphere. So things are going to be suffering immensely. I'm not surprised that the farmers are telling her that, yeah, they're living in a fairy tale. But that's been the answer, right? It's been this childish, complete fantasy that we don't have to worry about second-order consequences of things, where it's like Jen Psaki, right, the press secretary, saying like, none of this would happen if you ever just bought an electric car, or that discount Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert saying, I don't mind paying $15 a gallon because I drive a Tesla, not thinking about natural gas or oil that is necessary to charge EVs. But again, we live in this state of homeopathic politics where it's just like, Slava Ukrainia, and let's not think about any of the consequences as why my gas prices are so expensive, or why I can't charge my Tesla, or why I can't get, greens from a grocer. So, as long as I get the feel good dopamine part and not the rest of it, so this tiny little pellet, the homeopathic part, then yeah, things are just going to be a mess. But yeah, it's basically a let them eat cake moment for sure. Even if that was apocryphal, it definitely is very real for us today. Just drive an electric vehicle, just go drive a Tesla. So it's going to be absolutely insane. But let's see here. This is from Mark. He says, a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine, in Sri Lanka, organic farming went catastrophically wrong. Their yields went downhill, and this was pushed in mass by the state. So even if there is a move right to go organic, that article probably gives us a very good model about what Sri Lanka did and what they went wrong. We might see the same thing here in the UK. And the Lord only knows what it's going to look like in Texas. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things are going to happen here, and it all feels oddly, conspiratorial, where you're like, oh, this might have an impact with things like not owning anything by 2030 and being happy about it, or having these climate goals met. So it's been increasingly concerning, right? And as you know, has been mentioned here, Americans have been living so insulated from the consequences of their actions for so long. It'll be interesting to see it hit them in the face. And that's the one thing, right? America's been uniquely immune to a lot of things due to the state of its economy and its size, and then also because we have two oceans that sort of keep us separated from the rest of the world. So things are definitely going to be in that sort of direction, and we will definitely be seeing things. And George Sagan points out, this is something to also keep in mind. I paid close to $200 for groceries this week, and that's for a single guy, no wife, no kids. So, I mean, if prices are that high, and I'd imagine, George, that you're probably a frugal individual and you're not just spending willy-nilly, then those are the consequences. I mean, things are going to get rough. I told this story on Orrin McIntyre's stream a couple of weeks ago that we got really excited because we ordered groceries from Walmart and we picked them up and we got like an extra $45 worth of ground beef in there that we didn't pay for. And we all got like really pumped. Like, hey, like we didn't pay for this meat, but it's ours. So, I mean, I would imagine for sure that that's the case. But as Skeptical Wave says, it's time for some fasting. Well, those who observe Lent, the Great Fast, Orthodox and Catholic Christians are all probably kind of just chuckling at this. For instance, I gave up fast food for Lent as well. So it's nice because that's the one real vice that I do have these days because I don't smoke, I don't drink anymore. But Lord knows I go to Whataburger probably a little too often. So that's what I gave up for sure. But yeah, and George, you mentioned that you live within your means. So yeah, exactly. So plenty of stuff to go on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll probably continue the diplomatic discussion next week as well. I want to focus more so on the OPEC countries and India in particular, especially as America tries to renew its diplomatic and focus, abroad as well. And so, I mean, of course, if you're already practicing Lent, right, you're abstaining from meat, you're abstaining from dairy as well, right? So all those things are definitely to keep in mind there. So the meat police will be knocking at your door, as Not Sure says. But of course, again, that's all that I have for you all today. We will continue this conversation next week on diplomacy and second order impacts. And for all of you who are going through Lent and the Great Fast, I hope that it continues on very well for you all. God be with everyone. Be prudent, everybody, and I'll see you all next time.